has done an adequate job, is to differentiate on the front end what's really needed here, and what is the scope of the problem, what's the source of it, and how do we manage to deal with it. And then I'm going to make a pitch to you. You're here because Dr. Koopman said, we'd like just an update. Well, you also can be of help to the things that I believe in, and we should be doing more of these things across boundaries, and I'll explain that. So that's the agenda. So I want to thank you. I sort of did, I knew a little, but not that much. And I don't know, can you guys see that screen? Okay. Because I think this comes from the literature of the Stephen ministers. And I looked at it and I thought, very interesting, and I'm going to just allude to this as we go through this. One of the things that I started when I began the University of Michigan Depression Center, which, as Dr. Koopman explained, was the first of its kind in the world. And basically, the message was, this isn't something that we sort of describe a problem and say, if you have this, you've got to come to us and get treatment. There's not enough psychiatrists, there's not enough psychologists, there's not enough. So one of the initial steps was for us to start what we called a peer-to-peer program. And that was to reach out to schools, starting with first colleges, then high schools, and then we're now down to 8th grade, where we're teaching individuals about how can you tell if your friends are struggling. And your job is to try to help, not necessarily to be a therapist, but to try to help and to do what's necessary, but not to avoid it because, you can't talk about those things. And I think that was the peer-to-peer. Simultaneously, way back when the Depression Center got started, we had a military conflict underway, and we had a lot of veterans that were coming back. And so the Depression Center started a military program, and part of doing this was to sort of say, man, there's not enough of us. And so we talked with a number of the students who had served, and they said, let us help. And so we ended up doing a, quote, buddy-to-buddy. That was military jargon. They said, you take care of your buddy, you never leave him behind. And teach us. AAA, the battery sizes. And it's true with all of the treatments, and I'll show you, we'll not spend much time on it, but I'll show you a slide with the available litany of treatments that we now have and use. And people latch onto it. Well, my favorite is this. Well, when you're starting with a favorite treatment, rather than a treatment that's indicated for you, you need a AA. Not the AAA isn't even going to fit in your battery case or something. I'm carrying this to the hilt now. So, but the precision treatment goal is something that I think is especially for the Stephen ministers, is worth keeping in mind. It's not our jobs individually to sort of say, I can tell you what you need. It's our job to sort of get things channeled. And then let's talk about stigma, and I'll try and give you some of my subtle tips. So this is, when I tell this to people, they scoff sometimes, but these are data from the World Health Organization, from NIH. That's basically one of the NIH directors. Depression all by itself, clinical depression, officially known as major depressive disorder, leads the world in medical disability more than anything else. Oh, people say, well, come on, cancer, heart disease, leads the world in medical disability. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the most severe. It's just not got the same quality of treatments. In some cases, it's not diagnosed and picked up. And that word that you're going to hear me use a lot, so that you're sick of it, it's stigmatized still. We're winning that fight, but it's still there. And that's partially the help, largely the help that we can give each other. It's the second most expensive disorder in the United States. What's first? Those of you who could read the fine print over there, you can probably pick it up. But what do you think? What's dollars and cents? What do the insurance companies, not insurance, wrong figure, my word, my mistake, because it's not that they pay out the dollars in insurance payments, because they don't. It's not reimbursed to that effect. But if you take cardiovascular, and if you start looking at the others, next is alcoholism. And these are basically burden of disease, and they're linked in some cases, but in cost, it's basically cancer and cardiovascular is first, depression is second, and cancer is third. And so you're talking in that category of these are vitally important and costly illnesses. And that reason for talking about suicides whenever you seem to talk about this topic is that 70% of suicides have struggled, and are struggling with suicide. Being something that was terrible. This is 40, 50 years ago. The weeping, wailing, woeful woman, and it was terrible. It was stigmatizing, and it was, and in actuality, there is a bit of a gender difference, but it's by no means restricted to women, and it's not got that characteristic, and it actually is something that starts young. So for 40 plus years, I've been saying, we need to be screening. We need to be screening. We need to do it in schools. We screen for pediatric illnesses at ages of 1 week. But for some reason, despite the oppressive impact that these things have, we don't do enough of it. And that's still something that should be done. The word stress can't be avoided when people talk about clinical depression, anxiety. So let's look at some, and then you can join me and a couple others. an adolescent, I'm not as attractive as others. I'm concerned about career direction and money, my parents' marriage. These are made up by me. I can't keep up with others, in a work situation. Substance use, sleep shifts, I'll talk about that. I mean, by the way, one of the higher risk categories for suicide, think about this, fire department people and police corrections workers. You think it's just that stress. I mean, they do so many good things. Certainly it's stressful. But what else have we done? And maybe even the impact that it has on nursing populations and on physicians. What have we done in making it? My mother was a head nurse in Winona, Minnesota, and at some point, to do something, she actually became a night nurse, because otherwise she was 7 to 3, and then 3 to 11, and then 11 to 7. She was bouncing through shifts. And we do that with police people. It's horrible. And I think the sleep impact is in some cases, what you can almost hear inferred, is deadly. And okay, so what did I do now? Critical parents, bosses, I think you're getting the point, and all of you can do your own. Stigma discourages treatments, and what we end up having is that pattern that gets to be what I referred to just a few minutes ago, where something has an onset and persists and then gets worse. The themes for the Depression Center when we started it, and I sort of thought, let's come up with a mission statement that's understandable. One, we essentially need to find it earlier because that's when it starts. Two, we need to develop better treatments so that we can get people better. And the code word for 3 is maintenance of wellness. And that's an aim, that's a goal. It's not always achievable, but even people with diabetes and cancer and stuff can have sustained systems where they're doing very well, and even though they have an illness and they acknowledge it, the goal would be to essentially get us to the point where we have something that is maintenance of wellness. And the next one was to achieve any of these, we're going to have to overcome stigma and diversion, but I'll say it anyway because Charlie alluded to it in the introduction. When I started the Depression Center, people were telling me, this is 2001 when I made that proposal, and when it was being even considered by the Board of Regents and by the Dean of the Medical School and stuff, you can't call it that. Yeah, nobody will come. And it's, and it was the idea being that the word would drive people away. And my reference is one that I think you'll all resonate with because I'm looking at the age of this audience, and you all grew up in my era, and all you have to do, and this is the one I used to use and still do, is say, yes, cancer was once whispered about. It was the big C, the big C, and we didn't even mention the word because it was so frightening, and somehow it was going to come. Now this was now 22 years ago, but when I was doing the proposal, now we have a national network of cancer centers, and everybody does screening, and we are going to do the same thing with depression and bipolar illness, and essentially I think we've got a pretty good start. So moving on, these are brain illnesses. This is the hard part that always in society produces, I said earlier. So pretend you're medical students, but I also said social work students, psychology students, or whatever. It's not a situation of locking this into, you gotta think pills or something, and because you don't. But environment and stressors come, they get expressed in genes. It's why people have palpitations. It's why sometimes people will have atrial flutter. That's cardiac. Some have that. Genes change. And in those who are vulnerable, circuits and brain structures are altered. And then you end up having various things change, thoughts, perceptions, the anxiety, the features, the cardiac rates. This isn't locked into just a few subjective things. The physical features of depression are amazing. Appetite changes, speech changes. I once wrote an article that still gets quoted from 1976 that is the varicose fold. For a while, you used to be able to try and do it, but there's an actual expression that and that Variguth, who was a neurologist from Roman and Greek days, referred to varicose fold, which was in the forehead, a wrinkling that he said characterized those with depression. And I found a picture, and I published it, and it still gets used. You know, it's just that we don't pretend to make the association, but all of you who have had a relative or a friend who has struggled with depression know you can see features in the face, you can hear it in the voice. I've had so many family members tell me, oh my gosh, I can tell when mom is going into another episode. All I have to do is listen on the phone. And, you know, and it becomes something fairly dramatic. So brains change, and they're reflecting genetics. If I had, I don't, I'm fortunate, if I had a twin with manic depressive illness, an identical twin, the odds are about 80% I'm going to have it. 80. That's pretty heavy genetic loading. What about depression? Nowhere near as much, just like diabetes. So if I had a mom or a sibling, you know, 15, 20%, this kind of stuff that's in the family risk. If you load it up and you have 2 or 3, it's going up. I have a mother and an uncle, my mother's brother and her sister, all of whom had diabetes. And my brother and sister have it. Maybe having the fortune to just be a doctor, I live my life sort of saying, I want to do my best to keep that A1C, that hemoglobin A1C down low. And, you know, along the way, it became the struggle to control some things. Both my brother and sister didn't, and they're now taking insulin. You know, that's when you have those family histories, we need to pay attention. And these things actually have some family histories associated with them that are fairly profound. Bipolar illness, manic depression may be among the most genetically transmitted. And then you have signs and symptoms, and that show up, and we make diagnostic labels. And then what do doctors do? They latch on to one. They like that one. I like generalized anxiety disorder. So anybody who has anxiety, rather than chase down what's the best treatment, that's your diagnosis. And so I think you're getting the story here. But putting it all together, now we're back to Karen's comment, precision treatments are needed because we have multiple causes for these things that I'm telling you about that seem to set it off. Because it's not just something that we walk around with and that we end up for some getting depression. What about the football players who have head injuries? What about the person who has a traumatic brain injury from a car and they end up with depression? What about the people who have pancreatic cancer, of all things, which is weirdly associated with sometimes the onset of depression before the cancer is even found? And so you end up having these things where somewhere along the way, what about hypothyroidism? People have too little thyroid and they end up getting fatigued and lethargic and they gain weight and they get sluggish and they talk about the brain being slowed down. And if it's not picked up, oh, you have depression. You know, well, they do. but they have depression secondary to hypothyroidism. What needs the treatment? What is the precision treatment that we're looking for? What about chronic pain? And then the whole thing about new. It's brand new, but this is really important, I think. We're learning that inflammatory conditions, arthritic, severe things, these are somehow linked to the overlay that goes on. And is that a little bit, I'm going to sneak in on this now a few times in the remaining 10-15 minutes as we talk on this, and then we'll discuss on the whole issue of COVID. So the flawed brain that's been written about with those with COVID illnesses, it's not imaginary, it's inflammatory. And they call it severe acute respiratory infection, SARS. That's where the name came from, because that was the key feature. But it goes bad up here, it goes bad in the kidneys, it goes bad in the vessels with the people with cardiac stuff. So inflammatory things in general sometimes can be a cause. So maybe they have depression, and maybe it needs treatment with conventional interventions that we would do, whether those be psychotherapy or antidepressants or mood stabilizers or something, but they need the underlying condition treated. And that's where it's important for us to treat the whole person and not get locked into our little categories. And there are more, and the more are, alcohol, substance misuse. It's probably, as I said in the early things, one of the more common things that produces depression. And sadly, for those who have elderly parents, Alzheimer's and cognitive changes that occur are associated with these things. So I'm creating a picture for you, even though the Depression Center has a major depressive disorder, this kind of stuff, and bipolar illness, and that's a focus. But I think I'm also trying to send a signal that not everything falls under that umbrella, and other things have to be looked at. Okay, so these things have really important medical/biological, brain, etc. roots, but they also have social, environmental, psychological, spiritual, substance abuse, economic, and familial stressors, all of them being there. It's what made, for me, psychiatry such a wonderful discipline when I was choosing it, because I don't know why, but I thought that way. I thought, your father loses a job and the whole family suffers and mother gets depressed. She didn't lose the job, but this kind of thing is there. So the cartoon is worth looking. It's a myth to believe one size treatment fits all. And it says, of course you feel great. These snacks are loaded with antidepressants. And so sends a signal. I am a pharmacologist, sort of in much of my image of expertise and stuff. I'm a pharmacologic, genomic person trying to find precision treatments and thinking along genetics, but I don't believe it does everything. And it's a myth. And I'm going to go over this one fast. This is just a diagram of a study that was done. So all of you pretend you can look at it and I could explain that diagram as if you really were medical students, but I'm going to instead just say, you're all a population, and it's a fairly large population, and you all have major depressive disorder. And we take an established treatment and we treat you, and we know what you're getting because we also have a placebo control. And essentially, the ones who are on the medication, we know you're taking it, we're measuring it, and we see how many of you get better. Established, the most widespread, this is 2001, the most widespread antidepressant available at that time. How many of you get better? 37%? Whoa, 37%. because we're monitoring this treatment and this is 4 months out and 37. What about the rest of you? What the hell is wrong with you? You know, it's your fault. I mean, the medicines are supposed to be working. So then we add something, or we change in some circumstances, and these were all of in this very large sample, juggling around, and we can get another, that little blue box that's in there goes up. And so the dotted line that you can't really see, we're climbing. And we keep doing things. And we throw in psychotherapy for some, and no matter what it is that we add, the bottom line, that dark line with the dots, gets up to 67%, something like that. And then that means that the remaining 30+% don't get better. And this is 1 year later. And this is, I would like to say, is better now, and I think it is a trace, but not meaningfully. You know, we still struggle with that in our field because we can't get everybody better. And in my judgment, that's because we still don't have all of the right answers as to how to find what is the precision treatment that really is needed for that particular person. And that's going to take us into genomics and into devices, artificial intelligence, machine learning. We'll monitor people better. We'll make adjustments as we go. Following speech, we're doing some of that in the Depression Center. You can record, you can do things, and you can look at speech patterns. And in some cases, they're the tip-offs for what's going on, and they'll tell you when something is coming back. Uh-oh, we need to have an intervention. That's where the Stephen ministers and everybody else who's doing stuff could jump into play. So all of those things are back to this, your point. One-size treatment will never fit all, and we've got to do better on that. What is the precision treatment? Right treatments, right person, right time, right dose, right duration. And we have a way to go to still find all of those. And that's partially why we need more research, but we need to be translating it as we go. I'm not going to spend any time on this. If you look at them, these are all of the things most of you haven't heard of. Well, you might have, but transcranial magnetic stimulation, or vagus nerve stimulation, or some of the things most of you have heard of, probably cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or analysis, certainly. But these are some new, some old, but that list of treatments is pretty long and getting longer. That's what the clinicians of today make choices from. And they're trying to do it. It's just that they're still doing it too much on assessments that are subjective. And I would really be happier if through the years we had actually gotten to the point where we could say we have the lab test that tells us specifically. If you talk to the lung cancer people now, they don't use my term that I just used. It's not lung cancer. They say, oh, this is CK1942, or something like that. And they've got them labeled down into numbers because they've broken it down. And so as we do all of this, so let's go through this one just to cover it, and not to minimize it at all, but to just say, all of you who are in the Stephen ministry know this. If you faced it, every death by suicide is a tragedy. We do a lot of work with corporations now because they're discovering that when they have a suicide in their company, man, is it difficult. In some cases, it ends up, we've worked with Ford and with McCann, and in some cases, they basically struggle with one person will die by suicide, and then all of a sudden, somebody else does it. And then a week later, somebody else. Well, those are people who are probably sitting there undetected with depression, and generally, in some cases, there are other issues going on, alcohol and medications and stuff. But we've got to have better ways of finding that. So what are warning signs? Worsening depressions, if they have it, highs, if they're bipolar, anxiety, this whole thing of looking at it, the expressions where suddenly the speech pattern changes. I'm just a waste to this world. I shouldn't be here. And, code words, and it's up to us to be listening, and everything I touch just gets wrecked. It's my fault. Those are clues, and those are points at which we should probably be thinking, all right, time for an intervention on our part, and we'll talk about that just very shortly. But mood swings, giving away things, personal things that they valued, is a clue. If somebody has had a collection of baseball cards and they've loved it and it's been there for 40 years, and then they say, it's old, I don't need it anymore. These are the things we should be paying attention to. One that I have always gotten into gingerly, because I recognize it's touchy territory. Means make a difference. And recently 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, now that I think about it, I ended up being approached by somebody in the community, and he said, Dr. Greden, do you know how many young people have died by suicide from jumping off of the parking structure? And I said, yes, I read the paper, I do. And he said, we need to do something about it. And I think what should be done is you should go to City Council and talk about trying to take preventive steps. And I did. And all that I said is, means make a difference. And you take away the imminent mean when things are really fragile, and it helps. San Francisco did it with Golden Gate Bridge. We did it in Ann Arbor. They put up a little fence and screen, and they put up, if you're really struggling, you can call these things. And the suicide stopped. People were no longer jumping off of the structure. Means make a difference. The one that provokes the problems in our society is more than 50% of our deaths these days are by guns. And right away, that gets to be troublesome. And I'm tossing it out for you to do your own thinking about it. If it's going to be there, and if guns are going to exist in a house, the ammunition should be taken elsewhere and locked up in a drawer. Because it's when people are intoxicated and drunk and angry, and the gun is there, and impulsivity enters in. So doing something about these things is important. Most of us wear seatbelts, and they save lives. And I think we can reduce suicides. I'm going to show you one more now. This is something that really is just starting to happen now within the structure, but drug deaths in America are absolutely exploding, and they're rising faster than ever, and many of them, it turns out, are probably linked with depression and suicide. What's killing the people? Why drug deaths? What do you mean? Oxycodone, Oxycontin, Tramadol, they're all opioids. 15 years ago, my profession, Charlie's profession, said, people suffer from pain too much, and we need to really work on getting pain under control. Well, there's nothing better than the opioids, but is it, a good solution? Suicide rates are skyrocketing right now, and in many cases, it's people who have actually been taking opioids. So right now, this is getting difficult. Be careful when you're working with somebody for the Stephen ministers, and they say, basically, ask, well, my oxycodone dosage just isn't quite working, and all my arthritic pain is back. Warning, bells should go off. And so strategies for talking, asking permission, it's appropriate. You and I have known each other a long time, and I'm sort of asking, I hope it's okay with you, but I'm gonna raise a tender question. I'm really concerned about you. Suddenly, I'm not finding the friend I've had for years. You're not laughing. You stopped playing tennis. I don't see you anymore. And, and when I do talk with you, it's stress and your face looks strained and there's something happening. And I would like to help. Not me personally, but I would like to help. I would like to sort of figure out how we can get you back. I miss you. I miss having the coffee with you. I miss having the beer. I miss the jokes. Let's do something. And I think what's on the next one is, even I will go with you. Let's go get some help. I'll go alone. Because to say, okay, fine, I'll do it, get off my back, well, I'll go with you, let's do it. And we can even go now if something is an imminent risk. We're on the way, I think, to getting some benefit because I don't know how many of you know this, but 911 has been a conventional approach to emergencies for decades, and it's been very helpful and life-saving for many circumstances. Call 911. I mean, even the three-year-olds know it. And 988 is on its way, and it will be a suicide emergency line. And I think if we can get it adopted and assimilated, it'll probably prevent some circumstances, especially if people are intoxicated and simultaneously struggling with suicidal ideation. Use proper language. If this sounds preachy, I really apologize right on the front end. It's not, I don't like it, and this is also sensitive to talk about. Well, he committed suicide. I hate the word. He died of suicide. She died of suicide. You die of suicide. Committed has a little bit of they should know better, and I think in a funny way, in most cases, when people are doing that, you're hearing all of the references and the complexity that goes into this. In most cases, this is not something that's a willful, can they be so stupid, and so I think we knock themselves off, you'll hear it, and I think it's the way that some in our society protect against even thinking about these things themselves. Don't do it. These are generally people who are struggling and they die of suicide, and if they attempted suicide, we ought to be happy that they didn't succeed, and then the goal is to try and get help. There's a wonderful website that's on there that's called AFSP on this. You can see it at the bottom, .org. It's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I was once the president of the board, and they do really wonderful things working with the community. And so stay calm, convey concern. Don't leave people alone who are acutely suicidal. I'm coming back in an hour. I want to make sure that you're okay. I think if you have enough of the concerns, get some help. And then it doesn't hurt to say, I have no reason to go on living. You do. I'm here. And I want you, and others do. You can, calm voice, and I will stay in touch. I'm going to be with you even when this is finished. So in kind of a closing little step, I think the reference that I made is, paradoxically, we ended up having, in the past decade, we've been doing stigma assessments of college students. And I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you I was surprised on this. So Sarah Lipson and Daniel Eisenberg developed this project, and we started it first on about 5 campuses, and it was to take freshmen, fairly large samples on these 5 campuses, and do a survey of how they felt about, how would you feel if your roommate had depression? And then it was, sort of, how about you? I mean, various categorizations, and would you go get help? Do you know where to go? It was just doing assessments. One of the things that happened is it caught on, so I think it's now got about 50 plus campuses around the country that we've been doing very large samples, and they analyzed the data about a year and a half ago. And from 10 years ago, stigma sat at about 50%. I'm going to generalize because I don't remember them exactly anymore. It's in half. We're cutting in half. We're winning the war against stigma. We essentially then have had something else happen on college campuses. They don't know where to go because there's nobody to see. There are too many people calling, and we have that. So they call our depression center, and they call Campus Mindworks and a variety of other things. And what happens is there aren't enough people. So we've got a problem in society when people now are reaching out. We've got to probably not solve it by just saying, oh, we're going to get zillions more psychiatrists. Nurses, you guys, and a whole bunch of other circumstances to train more individuals. OB-GYN, pediatrics, the campus mental health people for that population, you name it, the police. We've got to do better in terms of getting people the word out there. And we have a lot of company now, so something strange happened. And if you think about this, so one of them was from here, Michael Phelps. He goes public, and they had some before that. And I think Kevin Love, the basketball player, and suddenly athletes coming out and saying, oh, I got help, I got treated. And it was out there and it was percolating around, and it helped. It helped a great deal. I hired, first just did it in a bonding, and then he volunteered, and then ultimately he was doing it so often. I hired Eric Hipple to do this for the Depression Center, and he worked with us for more than a decade. And it was to be a voice, because people listen. I used to say earlier, before I stumbled into Eric, nobody really likes to come and hear John Greden talk. Find me Michael Jordan, who will tell you about, he didn't have it, by the way, as far as I know, about his depression and how he's better. And you watch the auditorium fill up with 10,000 people, and I think what we're seeing now is with voices and with identification, things are happening. Well, I don't know how many of you watch the Olympics, but when you end up having tennis player Naomi and gymnast Simone Biles and Mike Tirico from Ann Arbor doing the interviewing, and what is he doing? He's not focusing on your balance beam technique. He's saying, tell me about the stress that you've been facing, and boom, you can see this in polls. And we need to talk about these things so much more openly. And I think we're winning that part right now. Then we have to have better treatments and all of the stuff that you're doing, because the boost that's coming is really important. Some additional tips, and then we'll stop. All of you have decided what it is that you need to do. Some of you maybe, I'm going to join Stephen Ministry. That helps, makes me feel better. You can't do that for everybody. But what did you do? In my case, mine was years ago. I just sort of have a busy gene. I'm doing something most of the time. And years ago, it was sort of important for us to say, we are going to have a date night, Renee, every week. one night a week is a date night, and and we still do it, and you can do it more often than that. But if you get to the point, it's Sunday night is there, and before you'd start another time, it's a date night. And I think adjustments to sleep and work. And recently, we've been working with McCann, and they're actually saying, the CEO is saying, I'm going to watch this. There better be a major exception, because I don't want any emails to be transmitted between 5 o'clock on Friday night until 8 o'clock Monday morning. And I don't know, man, when we were talking about that with the leadership, how would we ever do this? Those are our work hours. And he said, figure it out. And I think the message is, the challenge is to say, come up with something that protects your life. And then, build it into your own thing so you feel centered. There's the reference to the email. And then sometimes that can be targeted with friends and with fellow workers. One more that I sort of want to just walk through real fast, because it's maybe one of the major tip-offs. People's lives start falling apart. Generally, sleep is affected. And, and interestingly, in bipolar illness, the more common sleep problem is they sleep too much when they're in a depression stage. So and people with major depressive disorder without bipolar highs and stuff ever, it's a question of, basically trouble sleeping, falling asleep, waking up. Early morning awakening is especially difficult. But these are tips to help. Okay, have a wind down routine. Start it 2 hours before. Not this thing of you're working hard, okay, and you slam the book shut and now I go to bed. It doesn't always work that way. And dim red lights. None of you are at this age. Well, some might be, few. But looking at the ages, the whole thing about the bedroom, bathroom lights. Red lights don't activate, essentially turn on, shut down the melatonin. And if you have white lights, they do. So if you get up and you go to the bathroom and you flip on a light, bingo, you might be able to go back to sleep. But don't be reluctant to put red lights with separate switches in. And that's advice I've been giving to moms who are pregnant and then having a baby and breastfeeding and stuff, or doesn't even mean that, just getting up in the middle of the night. Get some red lights. And it's amazing how thankful they are afterwards. Writing down the troublesome things, doing it earlier in the evening, and then saying, tomorrow, that's for tomorrow. And then temperature matters. Cool rooms are better. People who put their work table in the bedroom, it's a problem. It's just by association and conditioning. And then the one that I really want to sort of talk about, because I think this is something where Stephen ministers can also make a huge difference. Alcohol is a wonderful, if you will, anesthetic. Why is it that people fall asleep after drinking at a bar and have accidents? Because it puts you to sleep. You drink enough of it and you're sleepy. It is an absolutely horrible sedative hypnotic. It essentially lasts about 3 or 4 hours, and it's got what pharmacologists call a short half-life. So you're metabolizing it quickly, and at 3 in the morning, you're awake. And the sleep disturbance issues associated with drinking are so common. And what are they? They are the issue of, I've been really having trouble sleeping, I'm going to have a glass of wine before I go to bed. Bad news. And it just sort of, it often leads to 2. And it's maybe one of the better pieces of advice that I've ever given to people. I ask them that. The other one is that somewhere along the way, I stumbled into this probably 30 or 40 years ago when I just I was doing an interview with somebody, and they were really struggling, and their marriage was struggling, and the spouse was with her husband, and she said, "Dr. Greden, he really has terrible sleep, you know, and he scares me, and he'll be, so it's wrecking my sleep because I'm sleeping next to him, and all of a sudden he's not breathing." And I thought, uh-oh, we have somebody with sleep apnea. and it was treated, and his depression went away. And interestingly, through the years, mostly having done a fair amount of sleep research, largely because of experiences like that, it turns out that if you're a male and you're a bit overweight, and especially if you have belly weight, and you have sleep disturbances, 25 to 35% have sleep apnea. And if it's not treated, what are you doing? That's oxygen deprivation. You're not breathing for a segment of time. So it should be noted and asked. That's again just how do you, it can be very straightforward. But doing those things and then treating it is often a lot better than, oh, you need an antidepressant. You know, so all of this is when you succeed and you help people, and I know you, the people again in the room who are the Stephen ministers do a lot, celebrate it. And I really like this little slide because it also has the iPhone in there in a way of introducing artificial intelligence and machine learning. And that's what we'll be doing in the future. And I think at some point, let's get out there. And so with all of that, I would love if, and I eat up a lot of our time, but I think if nothing else, I'll come back and we'll do it some other time. I don't know what's on your schedules, but thank you.
Any questions?
I just wanted to comment that I think screening in middle school and high school would be so key.
Oh boy,
it's so
keep
hard-
saying that elsewhere.
It's so hard for parents to know what is adolescence and what is depression.
Well, the other thing, did all of you hear that screening in middle school? The answer is, I think, it takes voices from respected people to break through that. Why? Because there is a segment of our population that has seen screening as it's intrusive. Those are the ones who stigmatize these illnesses rather than helping. Oh, you're gonna, find something that is embarrassing, or that whatever. And we need to win that. So I think the bottom line really turns out to be what you just said is crucial. The teachers are all in favor of it. They find that it's beneficial. You find people, you can do it. The adolescents are good with it. It's the parents many times that object, and it gets caught up again in some of these head-butting discussions I wish we could get rid of. But you had...
Is it one major life change?
Oh, yeah.
Could it be retirement? One major life change might be retirement. I'm wondering if you've seen examples of that.
So, Charlie knows this. I mean, that term, you heard it, and I smile when I hear it. I'm now officially what the university calls active emeritus, which means that I officially, after 2 years of hunting, because we got caught by the COVID thing, and there was a search to find a replacement for the director of the Depression Center, and it got stopped because of the pandemic. You know, we couldn't bring anybody in, and so finally, these become choices that you make. Okay, we won't go external, even though there were some wonderful people that already had expressed interest. We'll choose, we've got strong internal candidates too. We'll find somebody from within. And so officially, in March, I, quote, retired. And I have jokingly said to friends, there are two ways of flunking retirement. One is that you can essentially take everything with you and not really leave it behind. And so you're now retired, but you're working harder and you don't have the support system that you had previously. And two is that you didn't do enough other things in life to have any value, and so you can't find anything that's worthwhile. And I'm flunking the first one. I took an awful lot of stuff with me, and I'm still loving it and doing it. And nominally active emeritus means that you don't get paid, but I'm doing it for other reasons. I mean, so I think bottom line is it takes work, and we should be teaching people how to retire and then what to do in a way that I'm getting there. I'm succeeding little by little. Question?
Yeah, I'm interested in some of the treatments you have listed for the treatment-resistant depression, things like the ECT, ketamine, I think VNS, and TMS. What's the effectiveness of those? Is there an order in which they are tried, or some things that work, or just?
The question, so it goes registered back there, is some of the treatments that are there for treatment-resistant depression. The day may come, just as a sidebar front end before I answer it. Yeah, tell me, your question was, tell me some general estimates of how effective they are. The answer is they're not just for treatment-resistant depression, but that's now how they're used. Why? Because we're still in, if you heard me taking some pot shots at the approach to care, it was intentional on my part. We tend to give, if I'm a believer in a certain, I like cognitive behavioral therapy, it works. Everybody who sees me gets cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, as a starting point. That's not so terrible. It's just maybe not the best thing for that person. If you're a pharmacologist, everybody gets this antidepressant, but maybe you metabolize that one inappropriately, so it doesn't work. So there are steps that need to be taken rather than sort of starting. When you get to the point now, we have ketamine is an anesthetic. I'll just comment on that. It's approved 25 or 30 years ago for anesthesiologists to use, and is given in 40 years ago. In fact, one of the people who was a driving force was Ed Domino, who was from the University of Michigan. He did a lot of the original work. But ketamine is given intravenously, and low doses, and it's a wonderful, go to sleep. You have a surgical procedure, you wake up promptly, it's really good. And then the kids discovered it. And it hit the streets, and they discovered that if you took it in certain ways, you could have dissociative experiences, a little bit like LSD, and it got a name of Special K. And so then the federal government got into the game and banned it for, you know, widespread use. So you had to have permission to use it even in hospitals, and anesthesiologists were sort of, and so what happened is all of the framework of all of this, because of the dissociative response, people started studying it. The Yale group said, gee, maybe we'll figure out what causes hallucinations, because some people would say, I'm seeing things. It's really wonderful. Again, like psilocybin and some of the other things. And so the issue of trying to use it to study what causes hallucinations, it was being given in research settings to people with depression and with other things. And lo and behold, some of the ones, and we have a ketamine program, it's wonderful. It's used mostly in the way of what you described for those with treatment-resistant depression who have failed to respond to other things. Why? Because it may be better, but it's used because it's done intravenously. It's probably got some risks, and you have to keep repeating it. But in about 50% of the individuals, I mean, the first time I saw this, it was like, whoa, because what happens is they haven't responded, and it's gone on in some cases years, maybe decade, and they go through ketamine infusion, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the infusion, doctor, what have you done to me? The lights suddenly are bright. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, this is the first time that I have sort of felt like myself in, I don't remember how long now. And the problem is it fades. And so then you have to use repeat ketamine injections. Now, to try to address that, J&J developed a product that is actually a nasal spray that is ketamine. And because of the legal constraints and the fear that it'll become a drug of abuse, you have to go in once a week and get the spray and squirt it in and then go back home. And those are not quite as effective, but the figure that you asked is an important one. If you have people who are treatment-resistant depression cases, and I've spent my life trying to address those, about 50% of them respond favorably to ketamine. If we just could sustain it in a way that's simpler, it would be wonderful. It still is. It's actually a godsend, and yet it doesn't solve everything because half the people don't respond. Well, how many of those have thyroid problems? How many of those have other kinds? So,
A couple of comments. One, I use ketamine for patients as a surgeon, and for burn patients that had to be debrided repeatedly. This is back 40 years ago. The post-op hallucinations could be terrible, and so you had to really be careful. The second thing I'd like to ask you about, because we have a daughter who has mental illness. We had to call the police at times, and we found the Ann Arbor police, unlike what you read across the nation, the Ann Arbor police understood how to handle her in a very, it's peaceful manner. They talked her down, and I'd just like to know, did they consult with you folks, or what did they do? Because they were just remarkable.
I would like to be able to say we take credit for everything, but not so. In the sense of doing this, the answer is probably about 10, 12 years ago, we actually had some interaction with the Ann Arbor police because they appropriately, I think, this is Ann Arbor, they appropriately sort of said, we need a better understanding of what to do when we go to a home and someone is clearly, I hated the word, but mentally deranged, because I was chair at the time and fielded the request. Can you do some things? And so we ended up having sort of like this with, and there were a number of things just to talk about it. I didn't do them. They were done by several of our other faculty, and they said, this has been so helpful. It's, I think, probably some of what you do. And I think our police in this city are a lot better. You're doing something now. I'm not in a chair role right now, but I still have a voice, well, maybe, and but I can go back and you're prompting me now. I'm going to talk with Dr. Delick. It's time to probably have that interaction with our police force again, just to do periodic things. We haven't done it for a while, as far as I know, because we do it with school. That's our peer-to-peer program, and the teachers, the principals, they all love it, and the students love it. They find themselves, and it's time to do it again. So thank you I'll be a conduit.
Hi, I'm monitoring our online audience tonight, and we have a question online from someone that was prompted by one of your slides, asking, is there an online survey measuring depression levels that you would recommend?
Yes. Is there an online survey that measures depression levels, if you will, severity, that I would recommend? And basically, if one goes on to almost any of the things, my gosh, this is, I'm losing in my head the official name, but it's basically the
PHQ-9?
Yes. And the reason what was interfering in my thought process, you didn't hear it, but it stands for Patient Health Questionnaire 9. And people refer to it as PHQ-9. And it's basically just a very simple screening tool that can be given to people in a repeated fashion, because it's where are you now? And do you use it? Yeah, the familiarity, because everybody starts abbreviating it PHQ-9. The anecdote once is, and they learned and they quickly adapted, is we were trying to get this used everywhere in University of Michigan hospitals at one time, and part of a screening process. It's slowly getting there, just to pick up on things. And in the cardiovascular system, a long time ago, now this isn't where it is now, but in cardiovascular center, they ended up, I said, how are you guys doing with that? Well, really good. We find it helpful. And we're only using 8. And I said, what? Well, we don't ask that last question. I said, the last question's the question about suicide thoughts. And well, that's right, because if they answered it that way, I don't have time. I can't. So we just tossed it out, but we really liked the scale. And I passed that on to Ed Goldman, who was our hospital attorney at the time, and he said, what? And so I think in a funny way, that was changed, and I think it's just really the illustration about how people try to avoid sometimes stuff that is scary, time-consuming, stigmatized. I would have to talk about that then if I, found an answer. And now everybody in University of Michigan is supposed to be screened. I doubt that it happens with everybody at times when you come in. But PHQ-9 is the answer to that question for that person. Tell them to look it up. It'll show up easily on its own. And it actually was developed, I think, 30 years ago by Pfizer. And it was, you first? And then,
I'm just curious. Do you know what countries have done research on the effects of the transcranial stimulation with depression?
Probably anybody who's got major research in neuroscience. As it happens, you're looking at somebody who testified to the FDA on TMS, as everybody abbreviates it, because the work was being done. And at one point it needed approval as a tool, if you will, that could be used in clinical settings, not as a research tool. And it was a real eye-opener. It's the only time I've ever testified for FDA type of thing. And I had 9 people sitting up there. Most of them weren't clinicians, and they were engineers and IT people and a few other doctors and this kind of stuff, but none of them really. It was in the context of just sort of hearing the evidence, and very bright people and good, but they kept protesting. Well, you get far better results than that just by giving medicines. And I was on, John Rush was one of my colleagues at the time, and he put his head up like that, and then he sarcastically said we were frustrated. There were 4 of us that were presenting evidence, and it hadn't soaked in. Either we did a terrible job or whatever. And he said, "John, you want to take that one?" And I said, "I don't know where you're coming up with your evidence, but when people are given an antidepressant, 38% of them get better." On the first round, I showed you that slide, actually. And you can have other approaches, and then you can get some of them better. But when you're finished, after several years and major problems, you still end up having 1/3 of them who have not responded to anything. And that's the population now that TMS was used to study, because the guidelines said, no, you can only use it for TRD patients. That's your starting point with us. So we studied TRD patients, and half of them responded. Now, that's not everybody, but that group is the worst of the worst, in terms of their prior response. And you're telling me that medicines do better than, they ultimately approved it. So TMS is, have I answered it?
Yeah, because 50 is obviously better than 37%.
Well, it's also...
It's permanent, whereas the medication you have...
It's also something now, just to give you really up-to-date information, and the good thing about all of you guys, if you pretend you're still residents or something, you're not going to be tested on all of this. But the whole thing about this is TMS now. This is where research goes. So first it was done. What's the shortcoming? Well, it's a chair. It looks like you're getting your hair done. A nice, comfortable chair you could go in. It's got music playing, and you end up having a device that gets, and with the magnet stimulation, you can see things like, you can make a thumb move, for example, and you move it around, and but you can target the areas as to where you're going. You don't try to do that to get people out of depression, by the way. It's just that you can be very specific, and with the strategy of sort of doing it, 1 treatment a day for 5 weeks. It's a long time, a lot of money, 5 weeks of treatment, and then the results were looked at. Well, they were not as good as with ECT, but again, you're starting with the ones who had failed to respond to anything. And it was then, well, let's see if we can do other things. So the Stanford University has just really led this part, and they did it where, come on, if we determine safety first, what's to say we can't just speed this up? So I go in, I have a TMS treatment, I wait an hour and I have another one. Not, basically not every day for 5 days a week for, 4 weeks, something like that. And then I wait a little bit and I have another one. And these are stronger treatments than what I was getting if I had the traditional model that was first approved by the FDA. And it's basically sort of saying, can we change the dosage? And it's showing too few people yet, so don't hear this as, oh, it's all solved, but it's dramatic results, better than what the traditional model was. And so we'll improve on that, and ketamine will maybe we'll figure out different approaches. And I think ketamine, by the way, is these medicines affect things like serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, dopamine, all of the brain neurotransmitters, the chemical signals that there are more. Ketamine is basically a glutamatergic signal. We never paid any attention to that glutamate and glutamine until 10 years ago when all of this stuff started on ketamine. And that's the way research advances. And so 10 years from now, we'll hopefully have other tools yet. In the meantime, we've got work to do, and that's where all of you come in. And even when the medicines are there, just think about cancer medicines, we still have to have the supports and the love and the guidance and get out and walk, you know, and whatever else. Somebody else had a hand.
I just have something to add to what Charlie said with the Ann Arbor Police and the response, that we've had a lot of, we have a relationship with Washtenaw County Mental Health Crisis Center. And they've been wonderful in responding either with the Ann Arbor PD or alone. We found them to be a great resource for mental health crises.
And I would agree, I think, in the framework of this, we've worked with them off and on. I've not done anything with them specifically, but I think that's where the alliances come. And
I'd like to thank John very much. I want to say one thing he didn't mention, but it's a big obstacle for everything he wants as far as the therapist being able to take time. If you think about the push by organized, well, University of Michigan, St. Joe's, Spectrum, RVUs, put the patients through. Well, you can't put a bunch of patients through if you're taking time to sort things out. For at least 15 years, I was my specialty's representative to the advisory committee from the AMA to Medicare. And it was like, well, it was very difficult to get the psychiatric reimbursement that was appropriate. It wasn't hard to get a cardiac cath reimbursed, but for them to take the time that they need to take, they're not, it's hard to do in the, I hate to say corporate, but the corporate medical setting that they have to work in. And until something happens for the payors to appreciate that, it's going to be difficult. I mean, I worked closely with your representative at the time. He's from, I forget his name, but he's from Fargo, North Dakota. And he was a fantastic rep, but we were successful in proving some things, but you've got a major obstacle there that is difficult to overcome.
Dean Cron?
Huh?
Dean Cron?
No. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
He's a really good guy. It was horrible.
push it.